This is a tour of a myelinated motor neuron. Its job is to generate an action potential. There's three parts to a neuron. The dendrites receive input and conduct information toward the cell body. On this model, we have axons from other neurons that are synapsing with the dendrites and the cell body. The soma, or the cell body, is responsible for receiving, integrating, and sending nerve impulses. The axon carries the information away from the cell body. A myelinated axon is covered by a myelin sheath. This myelin sheath is formed by this Schwann cell. The myelin wraps around the axon so it does not allow the voltage to get through. So there are nodes of Ranvier. This allows for a faster transmission of the signal, allowing that signal to jump and the voltage to travel faster down the axon. Each individual myelinated axon is surrounded by the endoneurium. It separates and electrically isolates each axon. This is a tour of the cervical vertebrae model with the spinal cord. Here's a cervical vertebrae. Here's the vertebral foramen. So the spinal cord goes through the vertebral foramen of the vertebrae. Here's the body. And then lateral to the body, we have a transverse foramen. That's where the blood vessels are going to go through to supply the brain. So over here we have our cervical vertebrae. We can see the spinal cord that's in the vertebral foramen. We know this is cervical because it has a bifurcation on the spinous process. This is on the posterior or the dorsal side of the body, and the body of the vertebrae is on the anterior side. So that helps us have orientation. Between the vertebrae and the spinal cord, we have some structures we need to talk about. So underneath the periosteum is going to be the epidural space. This is where, if you get an epidural, they inject it in here. And then we have the meninges. The meninges are three layers that are going to protect the brain and the spinal cord. So the outermost layer is called the dura mater. It's tough. Then we have the arachnoid. Underneath the arachnoid layer, we have the subarachnoid space. There's cerebral spinal fluid that flows through here. Here we have the pia mater. The pia mater is a very thin layer that covers the spinal cord. The spinal cord has white matter that has myelinated axons. And then we have gray matter that's in the shape of a butterfly. And in the center we have a central canal. It also has cerebral spinal fluid. Our gray matter has posterior horns. They're on the posterior side. It has anterior horns because they're on the anterior side. The spinal nerve has sensory and motor neurons, and they are going to enter the vertebral column through the intervertebral foramen. It's just a hole in between the vertebrae. The dorsal root ganglion, or posterior root ganglion, has the cell bodies of the sensory neurons. The axons of the sensory neurons are going to continue to the spinal cord through the dorsal root and enter at the posterior horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord. The posterior horn is going to house the sensory neurons and the cell bodies of the interneurons. The interneurons are going to synapse with the motor neuron. The anterior horn is going to house the cell bodies of the somatic motor neurons, which will innervate the skeletal muscles. The axon of the motor neuron is going to leave the spinal cord through the ventral root. And the axons are going to enter the mixed spinal nerve and then take the signal to an effector. This is a tour of the spinal cord and major nerves of the body. The spinal cord is a link between the brain and the rest of the body. We have cervical nerves, we have thoracic nerves, we have lumbar nerves. The spinal cord comes down it ends in the lumbar region at the conus medullaris. Then we have nerve parts. They're called the cauda equina, or horse's tail. You can see how they fan out. And it continues until it terminates. On the side of the spinal cord, we have the sympathetic trunk. The sympathetic trunk runs parallel to the spinal column, and it contains the sympathetic ganglia, so it can communicate with the spinal cord. We have some major nerves in the pelvic region. This is the femoral nerve. It's going to go down to the leg. And we have the sciatic nerve that's going to go through the greater sciatic notch of the coxal bone. So this is a vertical representation of the spinal cord. You can see the vertebrae are stacked on top of each other. So we have the cervical vertebrae up here, and then we have thoracic vertebrae, and then lumbar. When these vertebrae are stacked on top of each other, you can see there's a hole right here. This hole is called the intervertebral foramen, and the spinal nerves leave through these holes. When we go all the way down to the bottom of the spinal cord, we have the conus medullaris, and then we have the cauda equina, or horse's tail. This model shows the sciatic nerve going through the greater sciatic notch on the coxal bone. So some major nerves of note in the body. We have the cervical nerves in the neck. We have thoracic nerves in the thoracic region. We have lumbar nerves and then sacral nerves in the lower part of the spinal cord. Going down the leg, we have the sciatic nerve. We also have the femoral nerve. It's going to innervate the muscles of the anterior thigh. In the arm, we have the axillary nerve. It's going to innervate the deltoid muscle as well as the teres minor muscles. We have the muscular cutaneous nerve. It's going to innervate the anterior arm muscles. We have the radial nerve. It's going to innervate the extensor muscles of the forearm, the wrists, and the fingers. We have the median nerve. It's going to innervate most of the anterior forearm muscles like the flexors and the pronators. Note it's median and it goes down the middle. We also have the ulnar nerve. It's on the ulna side of the arm, and it's going to innervate some of the forearm muscles and the interior hand muscles.